The footage you see here should be not possible. And the reason this should not be possible is that, according to Vladimir Putin, where Zelensky is standing as of about 1 month ago, this is Russian territory. In fact, I posted a message that Putin made about this, and this is just one of many messages of different variations talking about this. And this is Putin saying, roughly 3 weeks ago, Russia is ready to ensure the safety of foreign journalists and guide them through all districts in Krasnoyarsk. So I don't know how to say that. That's how they say Pokrovsk. I've only ever heard the people who, when I was in Pokrovsk, who lived in Pokrovsk, call it Pokrovsk. I heard a few people call it this, but the vast majority did not. And so I never learned how to pronounce it like that in Kupiansk. So he's saying here that the Russians are ready to ensure foreign journalists safety in coming to both Pokrovsk and Kupiansk in order to film and show that the Russians control it and that they were able to take it over. Now, this was also paired with announcements from the commander of the Russian armed forces. And let me show you a map of when the Russian armed forces said this. This was November 20th. So this was last month, and this is not even a month ago. So to say this is a month ago would be wrong, because today is December 12th, and we're talking about November 20th. On November 20th, Gerasimov reported to Putin that Russia had captured the major city of Kupiansk, which, alongside other bits of the Kharkiv region, is supposed to be traded for Ukrainian-held parts of the Donbass under the Dmitriev-Witkoff plan. That boasted turned out to be premature. So, talking about the Dmitriev-Witkoff training plan, the idea was that maybe in return for the Ukrainians giving up the unoccupied Donbass, then the Russians could give up territory like Kupiansk or this other pieces of land, X, Y, and Z, and some trading of land. None of this had ever been agreed to, and the Ukrainians have already said in a counterproposal sent back to the United States within the last 48 hours that they are willing to demilitarize, possibly demilitarize certain areas, but they are not willing to give up territory that they currently control. So this was an idea, but currently the only thing we know for sure is that the Ukrainians and Russians are fighting for who controls the city. And so on November 20th, the Russians announced that they control it. And you can see here, hey, we've got flags here, we control it. Yeah, look, we control on this side. Oh, we have it on the other side too. This is the side that's Ukrainians have controlled. So on November 20th, the Russians probably showed Putin flags in the north, flags on the right side of the river, flags on the left side of the river, flags in the south. And he just said, you know what? I guess today's the day to announce it. And it's never been like the Russians have been shy to announce their capturing of a city. I do wonder if at this point in the war they decided to take like it's to take a fresh spin on things. Say, let's be more honest in what we do capture, what we don't capture. Let's be more honest about our military reports, and people would treat us more credibly. If they did that at this stage in the war, people would just assume whatever numbers they put out, it was double as bad, just due to how terrible the Russian PR game has been. At the start of the war, saying they destroyed more aircraft than Ukraine even has, before we then watched Ukrainian aircraft take off and then conduct combat operations. And so there were so many instances like this that the reputation is so terrible. But still, when Putin comes out and says we captured something, that means something. That means something to the Russian public. That means something to those who report on the war in Russia, and the bloggers, or even those who work in the official capacity. It means that something to the soldiers who fight not only in this sector, but all across the front in Russia, and all across the front in occupied Ukraine. It means something to them because they can say, hey, look, we won something, or hey, look, oh, we had this horrible tragedy. And when Putin announced that, that was another big victory that the Russians could put in their cap. The problem is, this was the situation on November 20th. Now, the situation as it stands today, because today it's December 12th, is it looks something a little bit more like, like this. Now, this is one map of it. I don't use Deep State Map regularly. That's the one everybody's sharing around right now. I use map.ukrainedailyupdates.com. But if you wanted to see the map that everybody else is sharing around right now, that map would be this. That would be this map, which shows what reportedly is a Ukrainian operational encirclement of the Russians that are still trapped in central Kupiansk. That the Russians who had been able to worm their way into the city, all the way down into the south of the city center, have now been encircled. And maybe they'll be able to get out along the river. Maybe they'll be able to go through some of the gray zones here, as you know, the Ukrainians obviously don't have a tremendous amount of manpower. But this is a very dangerous situation for the Russians trapped behind Ukrainian lines here. And the Ukrainians are engaged in clearing operations to get rid of those gray zones in central Kupiansk and eliminate the remaining Russians in those in those hidey holes and basements across the city. So the Ukrainians intend to take back the rest of Kupiansk, but they've already captured the north of the city and have done what I wouldn't say the hard work, like all the hard work's behind them, but that's to say that the most significant moves, tactical moves that they had to make here to win this battle, they have made that. They have made those moves. They have made it so that the Russians trapped in the city are going to be supplied by drones, and many of them will probably surrender in the near future unless the Russians can establish a corridor for support for these men. But continuing along this river and this little bit of gray zone that's left is going to be a death wish for anybody on foot. That's not to say that it is impossible, especially considering the massive difference in manpower between the Ukrainians and the Russians, but it will come at a massive loss, as the Ukrainians will know where they are coming, and it will take a decent amount of resources. And considering that the Russians are engaged in offensive operations at Pokrovsk right now, and they're trying to push the Ukrainians out of the north of the city, out of Mirorod, they're trying to push in Hulepole right now to try to collapse the Zaporizhia front line and push into artillery range of the city of Zaporizhia. They're trying to push on the Zaporizhia-Dnipro border. They're trying to push in Vovchansk right now, which I wonder how that situation will continue to develop. And so continuing to push everywhere all the time doesn't necessarily work if you only have limited manpower pools. And there's also a question, and this has been something that I've seen multiple times before, where the Russians will penetrate somewhere, where the Russians will penetrate the line. And I think the Dobrapila penetration is probably one of the most demonstrative examples in recent memory, where they penetrated the line for 10 to 12 kilometers, but then they didn't have the manpower to flood the line. They didn't have the resources to turn that penetration into a gaping wound that can be expanded and then flooded, because they didn't have the manpower in place, because the manpower that they would have needed were all tied up in offensive operations all across the front line, in Sumy, in Vovchansk, in Dobrapila. Of course, they're the ones there in Dobrapila, but then you also have Hulepole, all these other areas. And so if they're engaged in offensive operations everywhere, they don't have the troops ready and available to flood in. And so the Russians would have need more available manpower. And so the Russians have been encouraged by the fact that they've been able to maintain their manpower requirements. But it's one thing to maintain manpower requirements or even to slightly expand the amount of manpower that you have. It's another thing to change the dynamic so that you have enough manpower in reserve so that when you have that penetration, you can exploit it. So it's not just a question of just waiting until one of your sides lose energy and motivation and munitions and the means to fight. A war of attrition that ends when one side basically collapses, which is quite an egregious point to try to get to, or doing that versus a more penetrative decision making war of maneuver. I don't want to say decision making war, but a war of maneuver based on quick decision making that leads you to capturing big cities without getting trapped in the mud. The Russians can't do that.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
The Russians can't do that. They have showed that they can't do that, at least at this stage. until the manpower difference becomes more significant, much more significant, or the Russians, and this would lead to the same outcome, uh, expand their manpower pool, either by the Ukrainians losing a lot of manpower or the Russians gaining a lot of it by either massively increasing their payouts, which I don't believe they have the capacity to do, or by increasing the conscription model to include conscripts going to the front line. We're going to expand conscription and we're going to move them to the front line. Leftist Hog, thank you for the primer. Saw the stream title and wanted to swing by and see what's up. Been following, checking in since Hippy Dippy days. Love you bunches, Dylan. Thank you for keeping us appraised. Thank you, thank you. So, point is that the Russians were not able to maintain the force everywhere. But it's not just a question of maintaining force, maintaining the offensive force at all times, everywhere, all at once. It's also a question of the geography. This is another reason why the Ukrainians were able to do well here. If you look at the geography here, or maybe we'll get a better idea with this map, if you zoom in, you can see that there's a river here. And if we go back to when the Russians were operating in the city, you can see that the Russians were trying to operate across the river, not just here, you know, where they were trying to move across the river to put people up on this side, but in order to get supplies over, they had to move across the river, period. All across the river at all these different points, all the way to here. And that was a logistical strain. And so when you see these narrow passageways that the Russians had to operate in, these choke points that they had to throw themselves into to create this type of sprawl into Kupiansk, yes, it meant that they kept moving forward. Yes, it meant if the Ukrainians didn't have the manpower to fight back and push them back, they could keep pushing forward and slowly grind the Ukrainians down. But then the Ukrainians did fight back. They did push back. They had National Guard troops, and they also had a commander that was able to lead them to success. And at this hour, the Ukrainians control the north of the city. And I think it's in large part not only due to them having the National Guard there, which is considered one of the more competent parts of the Ukrainian armed forces. It is due to the river that the Russians had to supply their troops across, which complicated logistics. So I think that part of it is just the geography of where they are, of the fact that they had themselves and their positions surrounded kind of on three sides, and the fact that they weren't able to push their advance from the south or from the east, which would have allowed them to pressure Kupiansk from more directions. If you look at their advance in Pokrovsk, you look at their advance in other directions, much of their success did not come from bravely just like trudging on forward and street by street fighting, just taking house after house in this type of advance. A lot of it was slow encirclement by whittling down Ukrainian positions until they have encircled the city in such a way that they can choke the roots into it and then slowly drain the Ukrainian defenders until eventually they do the street by street fighting, where the Ukrainians eventually will cut losses way later than they should have, pull out, take a bunch of losses during the withdrawal, and then repeat the process on the next city, where the Russians lose a lot trying to get into that encirclement position, and then the Ukrainians holding out probably a little bit longer than they should have in many of these instances, but of course, as their communities, can you blame them, lose a lot during that withdrawal. That was definitely the case during the battle for Avdiivka. But I think the last reason would probably be, and you know, I cannot say for sure because I'm not in the room, and I want to make sure that, you know, I'm not personalizing this. This is not me. I don't want to start pretending like this is wrestling, or start pretending that this is some way like how can I put this? This is some way, some sort of personal endeavor or parasocial endeavor, because I do see people sometimes getting a little parasocially attached, not only to like Zelensky, sometimes other political figures, sometimes even military figures. It doesn't happen as much amongst OSCENT people, but definitely amongst the people who got involved because they believed in it. And that's not to say that it's wrong to believe in it, but that is, you believe in it, your idealism can't cloud your judgment. And I want to show you guys something. One moment. Okay, I got it. So I wanted to tell you guys about the person who led this, because the person who led this operation was not Siersky. The person who led this operation was Drapati. Now, Drapati was actually somebody who was redeployed to the Kharkiv Oblast in May of 2024 to halt a Russian breakthrough in the Volchansk direction, in which he did largely stop the Russian breakthrough from continuing. He didn't push the Russians out of Volchansk, but the idea of stopping a breakthrough, he did achieve that goal. Before that, he was involved in Kherson. He was involved in the liberation of Kherson. But I think probably one of his most famous moments, what most people know about Drapati, and not about his recent endeavors, but if you've been following the war maybe a little bit longer, since 2014, was a video where he was involved in an operation to move into Mariupol and break Russian occupation forces from it. There was militias that had taken over the city, and they had set up barricades to stop the Ukrainian government from taking over the city when the Russians were trying to take over Donetsk, Luhansk, and they were also trying to take over Odessa and Kharkiv and all these different locations, including Mariupol. It's just Donetsk and Luhansk is where they ended up having the most success after physically taking over Crimea. And in Mariupol, when they put up these barriers, the Ukrainian forces came in, a lot of Ukrainian volunteers came in and destroyed the barriers and retook over the city. Azov was very famous for this, but also Drapati was involved in this operation. And that's where this video came out from, where he's actually in the lead BMP here, smashing the barriers coming into Mariupol. He was part of this operation. So I think somebody with experience being in a position of significance in command, I think the geography, I think the National Guard being involved, and I think the Russians overextending their offensive potential, as well as just the angle of their advance, just the style of their approach, being not the most sustainable. And definitely if you're overstretched and you're not just concentrating, a lot of force in this one point, ended up being too much for the Russian advance in Kupiansk. And so now the Russian soldiers that are left in the city center could very well be cut off, and their exits out of the city are not certain and are probably very deadly. That is to say that there isn't an exit out of the city, as they can try to follow the trees here and the greenery to try to make an escape. But that is to say that the risk of escape that comes with it, the risk of death or capture, is very high. And so a lot of them will probably just choose the option of surrender if there is not a large counterforce coming from Russia to liberate them from the danger of Banderas personally dragging them all the way over to Kiev, or whatever they think is going to happen. Point is, this is probably one of the biggest Ukrainian successes to date of this year, and it's certainly the biggest ground offense, counteroffensive that the Ukrainians have conducted within the last 6 months. This is a city that the Ukrainians took back during the Kharkiv counteroffensive in 2022, where a bunch of groups like Kraken and some International Legion folks and others worked together in order to push the Russians out of Kupiansk, capture tons of equipment, which would help the Ukrainian war effort in a lot of other locations, and push the Russians further away from this major population hub. And the Russians since then, resenting that military defeat, where Russian state TV did everything they could to justify, where did this failure come from? Where did these losses come from? They had to come from everywhere. They had to come from somewhere, but he didn't want to accept that it came from the Ukrainians. And so you would sometimes see reports that it was NATO. It was NATO soldiers, that it was NATO this, NATO that. But once again, back in Kupiansk, for the second time, the Ukrainians are able to take back the city of Kupiansk. Here is a video that Zelensky filmed at the city entrance, right right after the success of this counteroffensive operation.
Бажаю здоров'я. Сьогодні Куп'янський напрямок. Наші воїни, які тут досягають результатів для України. Багато росіяни говорили про Куп'янськ. Ми бачимо, я привітав хлопців. Дякую кожному підрозділу, всім, хто б'ється тут, всім, хто знищує окупанта. Сьогодні надзвичайно важливо досягати результатів на фронті, щоб Україна могла досягати результатів в дипломатії. Саме так це працює. Всі наші сильні позиції всередині країни, сильні позиції в розмові щодо закінчення війни. Дякую кожному воїну. Пишаюся вами. Дякую всім нашим сухопутним військам. Сьогодні виключно ваш день. Дякую, хлопці. Слава Україні.
So Zelensky says glory to the land forces. This is obviously your victory. They had a strong position on the battlefield, gives you a strong position in diplomacy, and this is an example of that. Really singing the praises of the ground forces. What's interesting here is also where Zelensky is. So I tried to do reporting in Kupiansk once, didn't end up working out, but I looked at a few maps in the area, and that sign is right at the entrance of Kupiansk, and it is 50 meters from the gray zone, and just a little bit under 1.5 kilometers away from where we know Russian positions in the city still reside. That, they're very unenviable Russian positions, where they're not solidly connected to the Russian army, but 500 meters from the gray zone, less than 1.5 kilometers from known Russian positions, Zelensky still at this stage in the war, at the end of 2025, still making these very, very close call deployments. And it's not like the Russians don't know that there's a counteroffensive going on in that area, right? So you got to know that there's Russian recon drones, both fixed wing and just Mavics, operating in the area, trying to figure out what's happening. And, there has to be this one drone operator that must have been like, I was told to look for tanks. I was told to look for this armored vehicle. I was told to look for XYZ. That vehicle looks a little strange. What is that guy recording with his phone there at the entrance? It kind of looks like it's not worth telling the boss man. It's not worth telling the boss man. You just to think about exactly how close Zelensky is there and the risk that comes with that. But he continues to do it using himself as physically as a tool to try to increase Ukrainian morale, trying to highlight this instance of the Ukrainians taking back land. And this is probably going to be the biggest success for the rest of the year. So it does make sense that Zelensky would be right at the front of it, trying to highlight it as much as possible, both due to domestic morale, which they need to help, especially as we've seen the AWOL cases. They've stopped publishing the data on it, both due to the fact that they're not properly listing a lot of the AWOL cases. People get, an unregistered transfer and it's listed as an AWOL, but also due to the fact that the problem has gotten worse. We've seen the situation deteriorate in Pokrovsk. We've seen the situation deteriorate around Helipole. The Ukrainians needed this type of domestic victory, and they also wanted a victory like this for the diplomatic field, so they can turn to the United States and they can say, look, we can do this. We still have offensive capacity. We believe that we should just freeze the line where it is, which is what you guys said we should do originally in the first place. Which you guys said that you would freeze intelligence support if we didn't agree to. We agreed to immediately, and then we danced around until we're saying, actually, let's not freeze it. Let's give more land to Russia. So the idea that a position on the battlefield can support a diplomatic position on the negotiating table, that seems to be Zelensky's bet. And it's a good historical bet. There is actually more footage from his deployment over there, but I didn't want to actually, focus too much on just like idealizing Zelensky a ton and, reading like Zelensky's laurels. And so what I would rather do is I will show you guys this, Zelensky looks very cool in all this footage. I don't want to focus too much on Zelensky. It is incredible that he does this. It's just, he's done it so many times. It's like at this point, it's like, how many times can you watch, the dog do a flip? I'm not trying to compare him to a dog. Oh God. Oh no, gonna be taken to the Kiev dungeon. No, but I wanted to show this footage and read some Russian Telegram channels about what happened in Kupiansk, because I thought they were funny. And Yeah, no, that's the entirety of my justification, actually. I have no other justification. I do think that they have some historical significance. You know, obviously, seeing what the Russians are saying at this moment, but I also just thought they were funny. In recent days, the situation in Kupiansk has seriously deteriorated. Taking advantage of insufficient RF armed forces consolidation in the city, amid boisterous reports of its complete capture, the enemy went on counterattacks. Initially, the AFU managed to retake part of the apartment buildings in the Ublinki microdistrict on the southwestern outskirts of the city, after which Ukrainian assault troops began successfully infiltrating the northwestern outskirts of Kupiansk from the villages of Moskovka and Radivka. The enemy's goal is to cut off the Russian armed forces grouping in the city center from logistics via Hulbivka and Radivka, since the eastern part of Kupiansk is still not entirely controlled by Russian assault troops, and its connection with the central part is complicated by the Oskil River. That's the river that divides the two sides. A similar situation already occurred in early spring of 2025 in Toretsk, when the part of the city remaining under AFU control was liberated on credit, ceasing active impact on the enemy, after which the AFU conducted a series of successful counterattacks, knocking Russian armed forces out of many positions within the city. As a result, fighting in Toretsk continued months after official statements about its capture. A clear example of what happens when victorious reports on credit comes with serious penalties. Basically, people wanting to take advantage of taking the credit for taking the city instead of trying to treat the war seriously. This is where it's being talked about. We have another report here. I'll highlight this one so you guys can see their ever creative, channel icon and such. And let me read you the temper of this one. I just wanted to show you a more casual outlook. That's what they say. How to put this gently? Everything's bad there. Everything's bad there. Radivka are preliminarily behind enemy lines. Logistics to Kupiansk done. This helped the Ukrainians enter the northern part of the city. The guys are trying to counterattack, waiting for results. But hey, Kuzovlev made a great report about full control of Kupiansk, about 15 encircled battalions, and received Hero of Russia. Someone wake up the commander. The Ukrainians are flooding the city. Look, history is not a straight line. It is not predestined. There is not one outcome where you just enter in a mathematical equation and then you get a historical outcome. History and wars, by that matter, are not determined by an Excel spreadsheet, determined by a numerous amount of factors: foreign support, your domestic economy and how well it can hold up, morale, population, geography, whether or not your soldiers are well trained enough, whether or not they have motivation, what is getting them out there on the battlefield to begin. There's so many different motivations that just assuming that, okay, so the Ukrainians are going to be falling back on all these different fronts, the Russians are going to be advancing, that's going to be the next 1 to 2 to 3 years. If the Russians overstretch their lines, the Ukrainians will look for advantages, and with whatever resources they have available, they will take advantage. It'll be a question of whether or not they can muster the manpower to take advantage when those opportunities present itself, but the Russians don't have the manpower and reserves to take advantage of a penetration. And so to keep pressure along the entire front line, there is the ever-present possibility of them creating more opportunities like this for the Ukrainians to take back advantage. I don't think that's going to happen in Seversk, but I think that happening in other cities in the future is definitely a possibility. One second. Let me pull up the message here. I had it here. I know I had it here. Here it is. On November 20th. Wait, you got to fix that. Happy editing.